What is up, guys? Olivier Porte here. Thank you for checking out my channel. I was recently on a trip to New York City, and I wanted to share a very quick highlight reel of my time down there. It's good to be back home. So today's video has something to do with New York. It won't be immediately obvious, but I promise you, by the time you've finished watching this video, it'll all make sense. I want to talk about one of the most important things you'll learn about in Y Combinator. Doing things that don't scale. You may have heard of this before, but what does it actually mean? It comes from an essay written by Paul Graham back in 2013. It's available online, so if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you check it out. I'll include a link in the description below. So what's the definition of doing things that don't scale? Well, to answer this, I'm actually going to reference another essay by Paul Graham. This one's called Startups Equal Growth. So startups are companies that are designed to grow very fast, exponentially, as opposed to linearly. Now, startup here does not mean early stage. There can be companies that are early stage but are not startups. If, for example, you open up, say, a chain of stores, for example, convenience stores, a gas station, those would not be startups, even though they are early stage, but those are instead what we call small businesses. And don't get me wrong, small businesses can be fantastic. They can be very, very successful. But a startup is a very specific business, type of business that is going to grow exponentially fast. And usually it's going to take a lot of venture capital financing from investors in order to grow fast. You wouldn't put venture capital investment into a chain of stores or gas stations. It just doesn't make sense. Because startups require growth in order to survive. And, growth is one of the most important things for a startup, because without it, a startup will fail. But in the early days of a startup, you actually want to do the exact opposite of growth. It's counterintuitive. But in the early days of a startup, rather than focusing on things to make your startup grow, you want to focus really on only one thing, which also goes back to another classic YC-ism, which is making something that people want. So in the early days of your startup, you want to take things very slowly. A very hands-on approach too. It's almost as if you're doing a one-on-one consulting service with each customer or user that comes on board. You want to have a conversation with them, but don't talk about yourself or your company or your product or service. Instead, just listen. Ask questions. Hear what their problems are. You're almost acting as sort of their therapist. And make them feel special. And this sounds really simple, but this is actually much harder than it sounds.
You want me to talk to customers? Ew, that sounds hard. What if they don't want to talk to me? What if they say no? And it's just too outside of my comfort zone. I'd rather be coding.
So most startup founders would prefer to be building the product rather than speaking to their users or customers. Whether it's because of just laziness or fear of rejection or the fact that speaking with customers is outside of their comfort zone. For whatever reason, most startup founders prefer to be just building product and not having any interaction with people outside, with users and customers. And this is a big mistake because it is only through having these interactions with early users and customers and getting their feedback that you can know truly what it is that you should be building. Unless you're Steve Jobs, unless you're the second coming of Steve Jobs, who says that, customers don't know what they want until you put it in front of them, which is what Steve essentially did with things like the iPhone. He put the iPhone in front of customers, and he built it without doing any sort of research or focus groups, any of that stuff. He said, I know what people want, and they don't know what they want yet, but when I put it in front of them, they're going to want it. So if you're Steve Jobs, then just ignore everything I just said now. But if you're not, and if you're like the rest of us, then you need to be talking to your users and customers, and then incorporating the feedback that they give you to then build. I've said this before. All you're doing at an early stage company is talking to your users or customers, incorporating their feedback back into the product, and then continuing that cycle. Let's talk about Airbnb for a moment, because Airbnb back in 2009 is the perfect illustration of doing things that don't scale. So this is what Airbnb's website looks like today in 2021. Compare that with this website from its earliest days. It's a big difference, isn't it? This is the Airbnb team back in 2009, shortly after they were accepted to Y Combinator as part of the winter 2009 batch. Now, the founders of Airbnb had been struggling to get their startup off the ground. The company was on life support. Nothing was working for the company. They had spent all their money and were racking up heavy credit card debt. Even the founders' family members were worried about them. The founders came very close to giving up on their startup and getting regular jobs. But thanks to Justin Kan and Michael Seibel, they were able to get into YC and continue going. Justin Kan posted a video about this episode in Airbnb's history on his YouTube channel, so you should go check it out if you haven't seen it yet. So let's come back to Airbnb's website from their earliest days. So when they got into YC, this is more or less what their website looked like. Back then, they were still called Air Bed and Breakfast, and there really wasn't much there. They had a few listings, almost all of them in New York, but none of the founders had ever met or had any meaningful interaction with any of the hosts that were on the platform. So Airbnb is a marketplace, and marketplaces have two sides to them, the demand side and the supply side. The demand side, in this case, are consumers that want to rent a room for an overnight stay. And the supply side are the homeowners that want to rent out their homes or extra bedrooms in their homes to these people. Most marketplaces start by building out supply. And so the co-founders of Airbnb, when they started at YC, the very first thing that Paul Graham and Jessica Livingston told the Airbnb founders to do was exactly that. Build out your supply. How? Well, you gotta go to where your supply is. Go to New York. Go to New York and meet your users on the supply side. One of the things the Airbnb founders learned while they were in New York is that most hosts, the hosts are the people that are supplying their apartments for people to stay in on the platform. Most hosts were taking photos of their apartment using their camera phones, and the results were not pretty. Here's an example of a listing from back then. So the Airbnb founders hired a professional camera, and they went door to door to all the hosts' apartments and took high quality professional photographs of the apartments. Here's an example of that same listing that I just showed you after it had received the professional treatment. So what happened next? Well, the apartment listings that had the professional photographs received 2 to 3 times more bookings than ones that didn't have the professional photos. And by the end of the month, those listings with the professional photographs were doubling the amount of revenue that Airbnb was generating. So getting great photos was obviously important, but what was even more important than that was just the more general learnings about the pain points that the hosts were having with their sort of do-it-yourself photos and sort of the things that were not working in the platform. And these are things that you cannot achieve by sitting in front of a computer writing code. You have to go out there and talk to your users and customers to understand those things.
What are you looking at? No, stop!
That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe. I'll hope to see you in the next one. Until then, take care. Bye.